Hey guys, what sounds like a small annoyance in the modern imagination was, in medieval Europe, often a steady and exhausting fact of life. Fleas were not just irritating little insects hiding in straw or cloth. They shaped sleep, comfort, hygiene, dignity, and even the ordinary rhythm of a household in ways that are easy to underestimate now. And before we settle in, I would love to know where you're watching from and what history topic you'd like me to explore next. If you enjoy thoughtful long-form history like this, a quiet like really does help support the channel. And if you'd like more calm, curious journeys into the past, subscribing is a gentle way to keep them coming. Now, with that, let us step into the dim interior of a medieval room and look more closely at what daily life felt like when one of the smallest creatures could make rest itself feel uncertain. One reason this subject holds the attention of modern viewers is that fleas seem almost too minor to matter. They do not arrive in the usual grand historical form. They are not kings, battles, crowns, or cathedrals. They belong instead to bedding, hems, floor rushes, pets, corners, and skin. Yet that is precisely why they mattered so much. Medieval life was not lived mainly in moments of spectacle. It was lived in repeated contact with the material world, with rough fabrics, smoke-darkened rafters, shared sleeping spaces, domestic animals, and layers of clothing that were not washed as casually or as often as many people assume today. In that world, the flea was not a passing inconvenience. It was part of the environment. To understand why, it helps to set aside a simple modern misunderstanding. People sometimes imagine the medieval world as dirty in a lazy or careless sense, as though people merely tolerated filth because they did not value cleanliness. But that is too easy and not especially useful. Most people in medieval Europe understood perfectly well that foul air, stale bedding, rot, vermin, and bodily discomfort were unpleasant and, in many cases, dangerous. They tried to manage these things within the limits of money, labor, fuel, water access, time, and knowledge. The deeper story is not that medieval people were indifferent. It is that they lived under conditions in which comfort was difficult to secure and difficult to keep. A flea thrives in exactly that kind of unstable balance between effort and limitation. Human beings made warmth. Human beings made shelter. Human beings kept animals nearby. Human beings gathered straw, wool, rushes, and cloth into useful, necessary domestic arrangements. And in doing so, they created places where fleas could survive. A house might be swept, aired, or tidied, but if sleeping straw was old, if a dog had come in from outside, if garments were seldom fully boiled or thoroughly treated, if several people shared close quarters, then the problem returned with remarkable ease. The flea was not impressed by the best intentions of the household. Night, perhaps more than any other time, reveals the true burden of fleas. Daytime labor could distract from itching. A person in the fields, in a workshop, at a hearth, or carrying water still felt discomfort, but work gave the mind somewhere else to go. At night, there was no such escape. A room that seemed tolerable by day could become a place of annoyance and broken rest once the body lay still. Warmth drew insects closer. Bedding, especially if made with straw mattresses, woolen coverings, or layered textiles, offered hiding places. One bite was irritating. Several became maddening. Sleep, which medieval people badly needed after physically demanding days, could turn light, interrupted, and uneasy. That matters more than it might sound at first. A world of manual labor runs on the body's capacity to recover. When sleep is repeatedly disturbed, patience shortens, concentration softens, and ordinary hardship becomes harder to bear. Medieval people did not need a modern theory of fatigue to understand that a poor night in bed could shape the next day. The exhaustion produced by flea-ridden sleeping conditions was not dramatic enough to enter a royal chronicle, but it belonged to the hidden wear of life. It was one more quiet tax on energy in a world already full of them. Even clothing, something that often signals identity, rank, occupation, and respectability in medieval history, had a more intimate side. Garments protected the body from cold, dirt, and rough work, but they could also trap heat and give parasites opportunities. Linen worn next to the skin had advantages because it could be changed and washed more readily than outer layers, at least for those who owned enough of it. But many people had limited wardrobes. Fabrics were valuable. Laundry required water, fuel, time, labor, and suitable weather. To wash clothing thoroughly was not impossible, but it was rarely effortless. So clothes accumulated sweat, skin oils, and warmth, and with them came the possibility that pests could linger close to the body. For poorer households, the problem was even more stubborn because possessions had to do too much work. Bedding was used nightly and replaced slowly. Cloaks, blankets, and tunics had long lives. Straw was gathered, renewed, and reused as circumstances allowed, but not on a modern schedule of hygienic certainty. A peasant family or urban laboring household could know that bedding needed refreshing and still be unable to do it as often as comfort demanded. Poverty did not merely reduce luxury. It narrowed the margin by which people could defend themselves from the ordinary invasions of daily life. And yet fleas were not a problem only of the poor, which is where the story becomes more interesting. Wealth changed the scale and texture of discomfort, but not always its existence. Better fabrics, more servants, more elaborate bedsteads, curtains, chests, and furnished interiors could create an image of insulation from squalor. But soft materials, warm rooms, upholstered items, furs, and densely used chambers also offered hiding places of their own. Richer households had more means to combat infestation, certainly, but they also had more complex interiors in which it could persist. Luxury, as so often in history, solved one problem and quietly invited another. A noble chamber might have better linens, more frequent changes, scented herbs, servants to shake out blankets, and more opportunities to air textiles. But the very effort required to maintain these rooms tells its own story. Why hang herbs? Why beat bedding? Why order cleaning so often? Because comfort did not maintain itself. Medieval elites, no less than commoners, lived in a biological world that pushed constantly against domestic order. In this sense, fleas were oddly democratic. They respected neither lineage nor ceremony. A fine bed could still become an uneasy place. This is also where modern romantic images begin to fade. The medieval bedroom, especially in films and illustrations, is often treated as a place of candlelight, carved wood, thick blankets, and enclosed warmth. Sometimes it was, but warmth and softness came with maintenance burdens. Straw soured, textiles held odor, animals tracked in dirt, bodies sweated beneath layers, rooms with poor ventilation trapped stale air. Fleas took advantage of all of it. So the room that appears cozy from a distance could feel, in lived reality, itchy, stale, crowded, and only partly restful. Animals mattered too, and here again the issue is more layered than a simple warning against pets. Dogs and cats were useful in medieval households. Cats helped control rodents. Dogs guarded property, assisted in work, or simply existed as familiar companions around domestic life. Livestock could be kept very close to human habitation, especially among poorer families or in colder seasons when keeping animals near warmth and supervision made practical sense. But every living creature widened the web through which pests could travel. Fleas moved through that web with ease. The household was not a sealed human space. It was a shared habitat. The floor itself deserves attention. In some homes, rushes or plant matter were scattered or laid down, helping with insulation, comfort, and absorption. These materials could be renewed, but not constantly. Over time, they could gather crumbs, dirt, fragments of daily life, and the residue of bodies and animals moving across them. Even when households tried to keep spaces orderly, floors remained part of the problem. Medieval cleanliness was often a matter of ongoing management rather than final control. One cleaned, shook, swept, aired, and replaced what one could, and then time, use, weather, and poverty began the work of undoing it again. That cycle is important because it explains why fleas felt so relentless. They were not simply killed once and forgotten. They returned. A blanket aired one week might still harbor trouble the next. Fresh straw might help, but what of the old garments nearby, the dog at the foot of the bed, the shared bench, the cracks in wood, the piles of cloth, the traffic of bodies through a small room? Medieval people often lived in close material continuity with their possessions. The same objects stayed with them for years. That created stability, but it also gave small infestations time to become familiar adversaries. There is also a quieter social dimension. To itch in private is one thing. To itch in company is another. Medieval life, especially below the elite level, involved limited privacy. People slept in shared rooms. Families clustered together. Servants might sleep near masters, children near parents, apprentices near workspaces, travelers in inns beside strangers. In such settings, bodily discomfort was rarely fully personal. A person scratching at night was heard. A restless sleeper disturbed others. A bedmate noticed. An innkeeper knew. Shame may be too strong a word in every case, but embarrassment and irritation certainly had their place. Fleas could chip away not only at rest, but at dignity. Inns and lodging houses sharpened the problem further. Travel in medieval Europe was often slower, dirtier, and more physically wearing than modern people first imagine. Reaching shelter at the end of the day might feel like relief, but shared beds, reused bedding, and high turnover of guests made lodging an easy place for pests to circulate. A traveler could bring infestation with him or carry it away with him. The discomfort of the road did not end automatically at the inn door. Sometimes it merely changed shape, from wet boots and cold wind to suspicious bedding and a night of broken sleep. Medical understanding, of course, was limited in ways that matter here, though even that should be described carefully. Medieval medicine did not operate with germ theory, but people observed patterns. They noticed itching, sores, irritation, weakness, foul environments, and the difference between fresh and foul conditions. They used washing, fumigation, herbs, combing, airing, and household routines intended to improve comfort or reduce infestation. The exact theory behind the practice may not have matched modern science, but that does not make the practice irrational. Quite often, people were working from accumulated experience. Something that smelled stronger, dried better, aired faster, or disturbed pests more effectively could earn a place in domestic habit whether or not its users understood the full biological mechanism. That is one of the most revealing things about the medieval struggle with fleas. The people of the time were not passive victims in a static, miserable world. They experimented within their means. They beat mattresses. They changed straw. They valued linen. They paid attention to air, smoke, herbs, and the condition of rooms. They knew that some houses felt healthier than others, some beds cleaner than others, some seasons worse than others. The problem was not ignorance alone. It was that knowledge had to wrestle constantly with scarcity, architecture, climate, labor demands, and the stubborn fertility of the natural world. And climate did matter. Warmer months could intensify infestation, but cold did not erase the problem so neatly as one might hope. Medieval houses were often drafty, yet bedding was built to capture warmth close to the body. Cloaks, blankets, and enclosed sleeping arrangements concentrated heat where fleas needed only a narrow advantage. Winter comfort could therefore come with its own irony. The more a sleeper tried to keep precious warmth near the skin, the more inviting the sleeping space might become for the creatures already hidden there. So what emerges is not just a story about insects, but about the fragile achievement of comfort in medieval Europe. To sleep warmly, to dress decently, to shelter animals, to preserve bedding, to use one's possessions for many years, to gather family together under one roof. All of these were reasonable and necessary responses to life as it was lived. Yet each could carry hidden costs. Fleas reveal that contradiction with unusual clarity. The ordinary strategies by which people made life bearable also created the conditions in which small discomforts could become constant companions. And once we begin to see that, the subject opens outward into larger questions about class, health, housing, and the texture of medieval domestic life, because fleas were only one part of a much wider struggle over what it meant to keep a household livable at all. Because fleas were only one part of a much wider struggle over what it meant to keep a household livable at all, they lead us naturally into the structure of the medieval home itself, and into the quiet labor that stood between ordinary people and discomfort. A house in medieval Europe was not simply a shelter in the modern sense. It was a working environment, a storage place, a sleeping place, a cooking place, and often a place shared with animals, tools, apprentices, children, servants, or elderly relatives. To live inside it was to negotiate smoke, damp, cold, waste, clutter, and the constant wearing down of materials. Fleas fit into that environment not as a strange exception, but as one of the small creatures that prospered when the line between indoor life and the wider natural world was thin. That thinness is easy to miss now. A modern person tends to imagine the home as a sealed and controlled space. Medieval homes were rarely like that, especially for the poor and middling. Doors opened frequently. Walls were imperfect. Floors were not barriers in the modern hygienic sense. Light entered unevenly. Drafts moved where they could. Animals came and went. Dirt arrived not as a failure of housekeeping, but as part of ordinary existence. Mud on shoes, straw on the floor, food waste, ash from the hearth, scraps of cloth, spilled drink, damp garments hung to dry, and the ordinary shedding of human and animal bodies all contributed to an environment that required constant management. In such a world, infestation was not always dramatic. It could develop gradually, almost invisibly, until a room simply felt less restful than it should. That is why housekeeping in medieval Europe should not be imagined as a minor or decorative task. It was fundamental labor: sweeping, shaking bedding, emptying waste, replacing rushes, airing cloth, managing the hearth, and trying to control odors were not matters of refinement alone. They were part of maintaining a barely stable comfort. When this labor was neglected, delayed, or overwhelmed by other necessities, the household changed. The room might smell thicker. The bed might feel less fresh. Vermin might multiply. The body would notice these changes before any chronicler ever did. This was history felt through skin, lungs, and sleep. Women, in many households, carried a great share of that burden, though the exact pattern varied by class, region, and household structure. If we want to understand fleas as part of daily life, then we also have to understand the people whose task it often was to battle them without ever fully winning. The ideal of the well-kept house was not merely moral decoration. It had practical stakes. A mistress, wife, widow, servant, or daughter responsible for domestic order was also responsible, in part, for defending the household against the slow collapse of comfort. That meant attending not just to food and fire, but to cloth, floors, bedding, and the general condition of the rooms in which people rested. This is where medieval domestic life becomes more revealing than the usual broad stereotype. The work of cleanliness existed, but it was constrained by time and cost. Water might need to be carried from a distance. Fuel had to be gathered or purchased. Soap, where used, was not free. Laundry took labor, weather, and space. Drying large textiles was not simple in a cold or damp climate. Bedding might be too bulky to clean often. Straw had to be sourced and renewed. A household might know exactly what needed doing and still postpone it because bread had to be baked, animals tended, children watched, fields worked, or wages earned. Comfort competed with survival, and survival often won. For the laboring poor, this meant that minor problems could linger long enough to become ordinary. A blanket that needed fuller cleaning might simply be used again. A mattress that should have been renewed might be tolerated a little longer. A floor covering that had gone stale might remain until labor or materials became available. None of this suggests indifference. It suggests prioritization under pressure. Fleas benefited from every delay. They thrived in the gap between what people wanted a home to be and what their means allowed it to become. Urban life brought its own complications. Towns offered density, trade, craft, and opportunity, but also crowding. Houses stood close together. Workshops and living quarters often overlapped. Waste disposal was imperfect. Water quality varied. Lodgers might come and go. Second-hand textiles circulated through the economy. Markets moved goods and people through tight spaces. In such settings, household pests did not remain neatly private. What one family fought, another could inherit. A garment purchased used, a mattress borrowed, a guest received for the night, a bench shared, a workroom crowded with bodies and cloth, all created opportunities for discomfort to spread. And yet, urban households also remind us that people kept trying. Municipal regulations in some places addressed waste, street cleanliness, or nuisance conditions, not because medieval towns were uniformly orderly, but because authorities understood that unmanaged filth threatened more than appearances. The same is true at the household level. People used what means they had. They aired rooms when weather allowed. They swept. They shook rugs or cloths. They valued fresh straw. They burned materials that produced strong smoke or scent. The modern observer may smile at some of these methods, but the important point is that medieval people recognized patterns of cause and effect even when their explanations did not match later science. The bed, however, remained the most intimate battleground. In a world without a clear boundary between fatigue and labor, bed rest was not a luxury. It was necessary repair. But the medieval bed was not a universally soft, singular object in the way modern language sometimes implies. Sleeping arrangements varied enormously. Some slept on bedsteads with mattresses and coverings, others on straw pallets, benches, or shared surfaces adapted for the night. Children might sleep several to a bed. Servants might sleep nearby in less comfortable conditions. Travelers might sleep where they could. A bed could mean an arrangement rather than a piece of furniture. That distinction matters because fleas did not require elegance. They required warmth, cloth, and a place to hide. Shared sleeping intensified the burden in ways that are not always obvious. Modern viewers often focus first on privacy, and quite rightly because privacy was limited. But there was also the problem of proximity. If one sleeper was restless, everyone nearby felt it. If one body carried pests, the whole sleeping arrangement was at risk. Infants, children, adults, and the elderly all inhabited the same vulnerable domestic ecology. There was no private mattress protector, no sealed storage bin, no convenient rotation of spare bedding. A household's level of comfort depended on collective conditions, and a collective problem could not be solved by an individual preference. This collective dimension shaped emotional life as well. It is difficult to feel dignified when the body cannot quite rest, when one scratches in the dark, when sleep is repeatedly broken, when a child wakes crying from bites, or when guests discover that your household is not as comfortable as you had hoped. Medieval people cared deeply about household reputation. Cleanliness, order, and hospitality carried moral and social meanings. An infested or poorly kept home could imply poverty, neglect, or misfortune even when the true cause was simply pressure and exhaustion. Fleas, then, were not only physical irritants. They could quietly injure pride. We can also see their presence in the logic of storage and textiles. Cloth was wealth in medieval Europe, often more than modern people first realize. Linen, wool, blankets, cloaks, curtains, hangings, and sacks all represented labor, expense, and utility. They were folded, stored, patched, reused, inherited, sold, and repurposed. But textiles also made excellent habitats for small pests if left undisturbed or poorly maintained. The more a household valued cloth, the more carefully it had to manage it. Here again, there is a revealing contradiction. What signaled security could also create extra maintenance burdens. A bare room was less comfortable. A furnished room was harder to keep free of infestation. The same contradiction appears in the use of straw and rushes. Straw was practical. It insulated. It softened hard surfaces. It was available. Rushes on floors could absorb moisture and create some comfort underfoot. Yet these very materials, unless frequently replaced, held fragments of living. Dirt, crumbs, animal traces, bodily matter, and the sheltered stillness that pests prefer. Medieval households were therefore engaged in a repeated cycle of renewal. Out with the old rushes, in with the fresh. Old straw removed, new straw brought in. But the cycle required resources, and where resources were thin, the cycle slowed. Fleas entered the delay. There is also a seasonal rhythm to this story. Spring and summer could increase discomfort through warmth and activity, while harvest periods intensified labor and reduced time for domestic maintenance. Autumn might bring efforts to prepare for colder months, to mend, store, and ready the house. Winter, on the other hand, could crowd people and animals inward. Doors stayed closed more often. Bedding grew heavier. Rooms were used more intensively. One might expect cold to solve the problem, but domestic warmth was concentrated in exactly those places where bodies gathered most closely. So the year did not erase fleas. It changed their pattern, their pressure, and the strategies households used against them. Children, perhaps, experienced this world most directly and with the least power to alter it. A child slept where placed, wore what was available, and endured what the household could manage. Yet children also reveal something important about how normal such discomfort could become. To grow up in a household where scratching, shaking bedding, or complaining about bites was common meant learning that domestic irritation was part of life. That normalization should not be mistaken for acceptance in the emotional sense. People still disliked discomfort, but they often learned to live around it, just as they learned to live around smoke in the rafters, cold in winter, and aching limbs after labor. Medieval resilience was real, but it was not the same thing as ease. Religious life, too, intersects with this world in subtle ways. Medieval Christianity placed value on patience, humility, and the endurance of earthly hardship, yet this did not mean that believers welcomed suffering in every practical sense. Monasteries, convents, hospitals, and charitable institutions all had to grapple with bedding, washing, crowding, and the material realities of communal life. A monk could aspire to spiritual discipline and still prefer a cleaner bed. A pilgrim could seek holiness and still dread an infested lodging. Sacred ideals did not remove bodily irritations. They simply framed them differently, and sometimes that framing may have helped people endure what they could not easily eliminate. The same can be said of medical and household remedies. Some involved washing, others fumigation, others herbal applications, changes of fabric, or attention to bodily grooming. These remedies are easy to dismiss when read from a modern distance, yet they belong to a serious practical tradition. Medieval people were observers of recurring problems. They knew that some rooms felt worse than others, that some cloth needed more attention, that animals carried troubles indoors, that fresh air could improve a stale chamber, that old bedding could become intolerable. Their explanations might be tied to humors, corruption, bad air, or general notions of contamination, but their daily responses were often grounded in real experience. In many households, comfort was protected not by theory, but by habit. And habit mattered because flea bites were not merely symbolic annoyances. Repeated bites damaged skin, encouraged scratching, and could contribute to sores or secondary problems, especially among those already weakened, poorly nourished, or exposed to other stresses. The flea itself in daily life was often most significant through exhaustion and irritation. But the body under constant small assault becomes less resilient. In a society where even a minor wound or skin condition could become troublesome, the cumulative effects of constant scratching were not insignificant. That is one reason the flea belongs in the wider story of health, not just of discomfort. This wider story becomes even more striking when we consider how medieval people understood rank and refinement. The wealthy could distinguish themselves through cleaner linen, better servants, finer bedding, and more controlled domestic space. Courtly culture, urban aspiration, and elite household management all invested meaning in appearance and order. But fleas were a reminder that refinement was always partly theatrical unless backed by relentless labor. A noble lady in clean linen still depended on washing, storage, servants, and material turnover. A prosperous merchant's home still required sweeping, airing, and vigilance. The polished surface of status concealed a constant contest with decay and intrusion. That contest is one reason flea-related discomfort appears so often in the margins of daily life rather than at the center of formal history. It was too ordinary to seem monumental, but too persistent to disappear. It belonged to servants' complaints, travelers' suspicions, household routines, sleepless nights, and the thousand tiny interruptions that seldom become famous. Yet those interruptions shaped mood and memory. A journey recalled as tiring may have included miserable lodgings. A season remembered as hard may have been made harder by poor sleep. A household described as respectable may have invested enormous labor in keeping such troubles from becoming visible. And visibility, perhaps, is the key. Much of medieval life involved trying to hold disorder at bay just enough that life could proceed with a semblance of dignity. Fleas threatened that balance because they were both hidden and felt. One could not always see them at first, but one knew when they had been there. They belonged to a world in which causes were often concealed in cloth, straw, fur, wood, and shadow, while the effects appeared directly on the body. That relationship between hidden cause and bodily consequence made them unusually intimate enemies. Which is why, as we move deeper into medieval daily life, fleas begin to connect not only with sleep and household management, but with larger events as well, with movement between regions, with crowding in times of crisis, with trade, with war, and with the circulation of bodies and goods across Europe in ways that made tiny creatures part of much larger historical patterns. First, this connection is almost invisible. A merchant sets out with cloth bundled tightly into bales. A pilgrim joins a slow-moving group on a road toward a shrine. A soldier marches with others, sleeping in temporary quarters or in the open. A ship crosses a narrow sea, its hold filled with cargo, its deck crowded with men, its corners dark and warm. In each of these moments, human movement carries not just intention, but environment. Clothing, bedding, sacks, and animals all travel together, and with them travel the small, persistent inhabitants of fabric and fur. The medieval world was not static. It was, in fact, full of motion, though often at a slower pace than modern life. Roads linked towns and villages. Rivers carried goods. Seasonal labor moved people between regions. Markets drew crowds. Armies gathered and dispersed. Religious life encouraged journeys both short and long. This steady movement meant that the domestic conditions we have been considering, the bedding, the garments, the shared spaces, did not remain isolated within a single household. They were carried outward, mixed, and redistributed. In that sense, fleas were not simply household problems. They were part of a wider network of exchange, much like the goods that filled medieval markets. A bale of cloth might pass through several hands before reaching its final owner. A cloak might be worn, sold, altered, and worn again. A mattress might be borrowed, reused, or inherited. Each step in that chain increased the chance that what belonged to one household might quietly enter another. The flea did not recognize ownership in the human sense. It followed warmth, proximity, and opportunity. Travelers, in particular, lived in a state of constant exposure. To travel in medieval Europe was to accept a certain unpredictability of lodging. Some nights might be spent in reasonably maintained inns or in the homes of acquaintances. Others might involve crowded rooms, shared beds, or improvised sleeping arrangements. Even in better lodgings, the turnover of guests created conditions that were difficult to fully control. Bedding might be changed, but not always as thoroughly as one would hope. Rooms might be aired, but not restored. A traveler might arrive weary and grateful for shelter, only to discover that rest came with a different kind of discomfort. This reality shaped the habits of experienced travelers. Some carried their own linens if they could afford to do so, creating a small barrier between their bodies and unfamiliar bedding. Others inspected sleeping spaces more carefully, looking for signs of neglect. There are hints in surviving texts of caution, of advice passed between those who had learned through experience that not all beds were equal. These habits were not expressions of fastidiousness alone. They were practical responses to a known and repeated problem. Armies amplified these conditions to a greater degree. Military life gathered large numbers of men into close quarters, often under temporary and shifting arrangements. Camps could be crowded. Supplies were not always sufficient. Bedding, where it existed, might be shared or minimal. Clothing was worn hard and cleaned infrequently. The movement of troops from one region to another carried not only political and military consequences, but also the quieter transmission of the everyday conditions of those men's lives. In such settings, the boundary between personal discomfort and collective problem became even thinner. And yet, even here, the story resists simplification. It would be easy to assume that such conditions were simply accepted without thought, but that underestimates the practical intelligence of medieval people. Soldiers, like travelers, developed habits and preferences. They valued better quarters when available. They recognized the difference between a well-kept space and a neglected one. They sought, where possible, to improve their immediate surroundings. But again, the limits of circumstance often dictated the outcome. A campaign could not pause for the careful renewal of bedding. Movement, urgency, and scarcity constrained what could be done. Trade networks, meanwhile, created a different kind of continuity. Goods moved along predictable routes. Markets brought together merchants from different regions. Urban centers became points of convergence. In these places, textiles, furs, and other materials that could harbor pests were bought, sold, and stored in close proximity. Warehouses, shops, and stalls held goods for varying lengths of time. Some were carefully managed, others less so. The sheer volume of exchange made complete control difficult. A merchant might take pride in the quality of his wares, yet still struggle against the slow intrusion of the same small creatures that troubled his customers at home. There is a quiet irony here. The medieval economy depended on circulation of goods, of people, of skills. Prosperity, in many cases, meant increased contact, increased movement, increased density. But those same conditions also increased the difficulty of maintaining personal and household comfort. The benefits of connection came with hidden costs. Fleas, in their own modest way, traced the lines of that connection. This becomes particularly striking when we consider periods of strain. Times of famine, displacement, or crisis often forced people into closer quarters or into movement under poor conditions. Refugees might crowd into towns. Families might take in relatives or strangers. Temporary shelters might be established with limited resources. In such moments, the careful balance of household management could break down. Cleanliness became harder to maintain. Bedding was reused more intensively. Clothing was worn longer without proper care. The small problems of ordinary life could expand under pressure, becoming more persistent and more difficult to escape. It is in this broader context that fleas begin to take on a more complex historical significance. They remain, in one sense, what they always were, small parasites seeking warmth and blood. But in another sense, they become indicators of how closely human beings lived with the material world around them. They reveal the limits of control in a pre-modern environment. They show how comfort depended on constant labor, and how that labor could be disrupted by movement, scarcity, or crisis. There is also a more subtle connection to ideas of health and illness that would have been understood differently at the time. Medieval people did not identify fleas as vectors of disease in the modern scientific sense, but they were acutely aware of the relationship between environment and well-being. Bad air, foul smells, stagnant conditions, and visible signs of decay were associated with sickness. Efforts to improve these conditions, through cleaning, airing, fumigation, and the use of herbs, were attempts to restore balance. Fleas, as part of that environment, fit into a larger pattern of concern about what made a place healthy or unhealthy. This concern shaped not only domestic life but also public spaces. Hospitals, for example, though very different from modern institutions, had to manage large numbers of people in close quarters. Care for the sick required attention to bedding, clothing, and the general condition of the space. Monastic communities, which often operated such institutions, developed routines intended to maintain order and cleanliness as far as possible. These routines were not perfect solutions, but they represent an organized attempt to confront the same challenges that faced ordinary households. The persistence of fleas, despite these efforts, underscores a broader truth about medieval life. Control was always partial. A household might achieve a period of relative comfort, only to see it eroded by time, use, and circumstance. A town might enforce regulations, yet still struggle with crowding and waste. A monastery might maintain discipline, yet still contend with the material realities of communal living. The flea, small as it was, belonged to this pattern of incomplete control. And yet, it is precisely this incompleteness that gives the story its depth. Medieval people were not defeated by these challenges. They adapted. They developed habits. They passed on knowledge. They adjusted expectations. They found ways to live within the limits of their world. Fleas did not define their existence, but they were part of the texture of that existence, shaping daily routines in ways that were rarely recorded but constantly felt. There is a moment, then, where the small scale of the flea begins to intersect with the larger scale of historical change in a more direct way. As trade expanded, as towns grew, as routes became more established, the movement of goods and people increased. Along with that movement came not only prosperity and cultural exchange, but also the circulation of less welcome companions. The same networks that carried wool, grain, and spices also carried the conditions in which pests could thrive. In port towns, where ships arrived from distant regions, the convergence of cargo, crew, and local population created particularly complex environments. Ships themselves were confined spaces, often crowded and difficult to keep clean by modern standards. Goods stored in holds, bedding used by sailors, and the presence of animals all contributed to a setting in which small infestations could persist and travel. When a ship docked, it did not simply unload cargo. It transferred a fragment of its own environment into the port. From there, the process continued. Goods moved inland. Travelers dispersed. Markets redistributed materials. Each step extended the reach of what had once been a localized problem. Fleas, in this sense, followed the pathways of human connection, moving quietly along the same routes that defined the medieval world. And as these pathways grew more active, as towns became more densely connected, and as the rhythms of trade and travel intensified, the stage was set for moments when the ordinary, almost invisible pressures of daily life would intersect with something far more disruptive, carried along those same routes that had always seemed simply part of the background of living. What is striking is how unremarkable the beginning of such moments would have felt to those living through them. A ship arrives as ships always do. A caravan reaches a town gate as caravans always have. A merchant unpacks goods. A household acquires new cloth. A traveler rents a bed. Nothing about these actions appears unusual. They belong to the familiar rhythm of medieval life. Yet within those ordinary exchanges, the quiet movement of insects and animals continues, unnoticed and unrecorded, crossing boundaries that human systems struggle to define. To understand how this worked, it is helpful to picture not a dramatic event, but a layering of small, repeated contacts. A bale of cloth that has traveled for weeks or months passes through several storage spaces, each with its own conditions. A sailor's blanket, used in cramped quarters, is folded and carried ashore. A crate rests for a time in a warehouse, then is opened in a shop, then handled by a customer. Each step is minor. Each step seems harmless. But collectively, they form a chain of transmission that no single individual controls. This is where the flea becomes more than a domestic nuisance. It becomes part of a system of unintended movement, tied to human behavior but not governed by it. Medieval people could regulate trade routes, enforce tolls, establish markets, and organize caravans, but they could not fully regulate what moved within the folds of cloth or the seams of bedding. The more connected the world became, the more opportunities existed for such movement to occur. There is also a subtle psychological dimension to this. Familiarity can create a sense of safety. When an action is repeated often enough without visible consequence, it comes to feel stable, even predictable. Medieval trade and travel, despite their risks, developed patterns that people learned to trust. Routes were known. Inns were frequented. Markets were established. The ordinary inconveniences, bad weather, rough roads, crowded lodgings, were expected and managed. Fleas, as part of that familiar inconvenience, were rarely seen as anything beyond irritation. This familiarity, however, masked a deeper vulnerability. Because fleas were so common, their presence did not immediately signal danger. A person who woke with bites might think only of discomfort, not of any broader implication. A household dealing with infestation would focus on relief, not on tracing the origin of the problem across regions. In this way, the very normality of fleas allowed them to move without attracting the kind of attention that might have led to more deliberate control. At the same time, medieval people were not entirely unaware of the risks associated with crowded or unhealthy environments. The idea that certain places were unwholesome or corrupt in some way was widely understood, even if explained through the language of humors or miasma rather than microbes. There was a recognition that some houses, some streets, some lodgings felt more dangerous than others. But this understanding operated at a general level. It guided behavior in broad ways, avoiding foul smells, seeking fresh air, valuing cleanliness, but it did not isolate specific mechanisms of transmission. This gap between observation and explanation is important. It meant that people could recognize patterns without fully grasping their causes. A traveler might avoid a particularly unpleasant inn, but not understand why another seemingly similar place felt safer. A merchant might prefer goods that appeared well kept, without knowing what lay hidden within them. A household might clean diligently, yet still struggle with recurring infestation. Knowledge existed, but it was incomplete, and the environment remained complex. In port towns, this complexity deepened further. These were places where the local and the distant met in concentrated form. Ships arrived carrying goods from across seas, sometimes from regions with very different climates and conditions. The time spent at sea created its own environment, enclosed, humid, often crowded, with limited opportunity for thorough cleaning. When such a ship docked, it brought with it not just cargo, but a contained ecosystem shaped by its journey. Unloading a ship was a practical task, carried out with efficiency. Goods were transferred, inspected, taxed, and moved onward. But in that process, the separation between ship and shore dissolved. What had been confined to the vessel now entered the town. Sailors moved into taverns and lodgings. Goods were stored in warehouses. Local workers handled cargo. The boundaries between environments blurred, and with them the boundaries between the small creatures inhabiting those environments. From the perspective of the flea, this was simply an expansion of opportunity. New hosts, new fabrics, new shelters, new sources of warmth. From the perspective of the human population, it was part of the ordinary functioning of a port. The connection between the two perspectives remained largely invisible. This invisibility is what makes the story both subtle and powerful. Medieval people were not passive, nor were they unaware of discomfort. They acted within their knowledge, using the tools and concepts available to them. But the scale and complexity of the networks they had created, through trade, travel, and urban growth, extended beyond what any individual or household could fully comprehend. Fleas, as part of that network, moved through it with a kind of quiet persistence. There is also a temporal dimension to consider. Change in the medieval world often occurred gradually, through accumulation rather than sudden transformation. A town grows slightly larger. Trade becomes slightly more frequent. Routes become slightly more reliable. Each change seems modest, but over time they alter the conditions of life in significant ways. The same is true for the movement of pests. A single transfer might mean little. Repeated transfers, over months and years, create new patterns of presence. In this sense, fleas become indicators of how interconnected medieval Europe had become by the later Middle Ages. They reveal that the boundaries between regions were more permeable than they might appear on a map. Goods, people, and the small companions of daily life crossed those boundaries regularly, creating a shared environment that extended beyond individual towns or households. This shared environment also meant that local efforts at control could be undermined by external factors. A household might achieve a degree of cleanliness and comfort, only to have it disrupted by the arrival of new goods or guests. A town might enforce regulations, yet still experience recurring problems due to its position within a wider network. The challenge was not simply to manage one's own space, but to exist within a system that constantly reintroduced the very issues one was trying to control. And yet, despite these challenges, medieval life continued with a remarkable degree of stability. People adapted not by eliminating problems entirely, but by learning to live with them. Fleas were part of that adaptation. They influenced habits, how often bedding was changed, how clothing was managed, how spaces were cleaned. They shaped expectations of comfort and discomfort. They became, in a quiet way, part of the rhythm of life. What makes this particularly compelling is the way in which such a small creature could intersect with both the most intimate and the most expansive aspects of medieval existence. On one level, a flea bite was a personal experience, felt on the skin, disrupting sleep, provoking irritation. On another level, the movement of fleas reflected the movement of entire societies, tracing the paths of trade, travel, and human connection. It is at this intersection that the story begins to shift again, because the same networks that allowed fleas to circulate quietly also had the potential to carry other, more dangerous elements. Elements that medieval people would perceive not as minor irritations, but as profound disruptions to the order of life itself. And yet, even as we move toward those larger disruptions, it is important to notice how indistinct the boundary between the ordinary and the extraordinary could feel in the moment. A flea bite and a fever did not initially belong to separate categories of experience. Both were understood through the same framework of imbalance, environment, and bodily response. A person might first notice fatigue, then discomfort, then something less familiar. The transition from the expected to the alarming did not announce itself with clarity. It emerged gradually, often in the same domestic spaces we have been considering all along. This ambiguity shaped how people reacted to early signs of illness. In a household accustomed to minor irritations, scratching, restless sleep, small sores, it would not be immediately obvious when something more serious had begun. A child who seemed unwell might be thought simply tired. A laborer who moved more slowly might be seen as worn from work. The body, already under constant small pressures, did not always provide clear signals that something had changed in a more fundamental way. At the same time, medieval households were attentive to patterns. People noticed when discomfort lingered longer than usual, when symptoms spread among members of a family, when a neighbor fell ill in a way that did not resemble ordinary fatigue. These observations were not systematized in a modern scientific sense, but they were meaningful. They guided decisions whether to seek help, whether to avoid certain places, whether to attribute a condition to environment, divine will, or some combination of both. What makes fleas relevant in this context is not simply their physical presence, but the habits they shaped. A household that regularly dealt with pests was already engaged in a form of vigilance. Bedding was inspected, clothing managed, rooms aired when possible. These practices, though aimed at comfort, also created a kind of awareness of the body and its surroundings. People knew how their skin felt when irritated. They knew the difference between a night of poor sleep and a deeper unease. This awareness could become an early, if imperfect, form of noticing when something was wrong. But awareness alone did not equal control. When conditions shifted beyond the familiar, the same interconnected world that allowed for trade and travel also allowed for the rapid spread of unfamiliar problems. A town that had long managed its domestic challenges might suddenly find those challenges compounded by something it could not easily interpret. The same inns that had always been slightly uncomfortable might now seem more threatening. The same goods that had always been exchanged might now carry an unspoken risk. In this way, the ordinary presence of fleas can be seen as part of a larger pattern of vulnerability. They remind us that medieval life was lived in close contact with forces that were only partly understood and only partly controllable. Comfort, health, and stability were achieved through effort, but they were never guaranteed. The systems that sustained life, households, markets, routes, also carried within them the potential for disruption. It is also worth considering how these conditions influenced the emotional landscape of medieval life. Living with constant minor discomfort requires a certain adjustment of expectation. People learned not to expect perfect rest, perfect cleanliness, or complete freedom from irritation. This adjustment could foster resilience, but it could also create a background of low-level strain. When more serious disruptions occurred, they did so against a backdrop that was already demanding. There is a quiet continuity here between the smallest and the largest scales of experience. The irritation of a flea bite and the anxiety of a spreading illness both emerge from the same environment. They differ in degree, not in kind. Both are products of a world in which human beings lived closely with animals, with materials, and with each other in spaces that were dynamic rather than controlled. This continuity helps explain why medieval responses to crisis often combined practical measures with broader interpretations. Cleaning, airing, and managing the household continued, even when larger concerns arose. At the same time, people sought explanations that made sense of events beyond their immediate control. These explanations could be religious, moral, or environmental, but they were attempts to integrate new experiences into an existing understanding of the world. Within this framework, fleas remained part of the story, even as attention shifted to more pressing dangers. They did not disappear. They continued to shape daily routines, to influence comfort, to require management. But their significance could change. In times of relative stability, they were an annoyance to be endured and mitigated. In times of disruption, they became part of a more complex picture of how the environment affected the body. There is also an important distinction between what people could see and what they could not. Fleas, though small, were visible. They could be found, removed, crushed. Their bites could be felt and recognized. This visibility made them manageable in a limited sense. But the larger forces that sometimes moved alongside them were not visible in the same way. This difference created a gap in understanding. People could act directly against what they could see, but had to interpret and respond more indirectly to what they could not. That gap shaped behavior in subtle ways. Efforts to improve conditions often focused on what was tangible: cleaning surfaces, changing bedding, managing clothing. These actions could bring real relief, but they did not always address deeper causes. When those deeper causes became significant, the limitations of such measures became apparent, though not always immediately understood. And yet, even within these limitations, there is evidence of careful thought and adaptation. Households experimented with different materials, different routines, different ways of arranging space. They learned from experience, even if that learning was not formalized. A bed placed near a draft might feel fresher. A room used less intensively might remain more comfortable. Certain fabrics might prove easier to manage. These observations, passed quietly from person to person, formed a practical knowledge that shaped daily life. It is this practical knowledge that allowed medieval people to navigate a world that was, in many ways, more demanding than our own. They did not eliminate discomfort, but they found ways to live with it, to reduce it, to anticipate it. Fleas were part of that process. They were both a problem and a teacher, revealing the limits of comfort and the importance of maintenance. As we continue to follow this thread, the relationship between small-scale discomfort and large-scale change becomes more apparent. The networks that carried fleas also carried ideas, goods, and people in increasing volume. The medieval world was not isolated or static. It was connected in ways that created both opportunity and vulnerability. The same routes that brought prosperity could also bring disruption. And as those routes grew busier, as connections deepened, and as the balance between stability and vulnerability shifted, the quiet presence of fleas, so familiar, so often dismissed, began to sit within a much larger and more consequential story of how life in medieval Europe could be shaped, and sometimes unsettled, by forces moving just beneath the surface of the ordinary. What makes this moment particularly revealing is that nothing about it felt like a clear turning point at the time. There was no single day when people would have said that the world had become more dangerous because of what traveled unseen within cloth or fur. Instead, there was a gradual thickening of contact. Markets became more active. Ports saw more frequent arrivals. Roads carried a steadier flow of movement. The texture of life shifted almost imperceptibly, and with it, the conditions that defined both comfort and risk. In such a world, the idea of distance began to change in subtle ways. A place that had once felt remote might now be connected through trade or pilgrimage. Goods from far regions appeared more regularly. Stories of distant lands circulated more widely. Yet, along with these visible signs of connection came invisible continuities. The same materials, wool, linen, leather, would moved across these distances, carrying with them the environments in which they had been kept. The flea, again, followed these pathways not as an exception, but as part of the fabric of exchange. There is a certain quiet inevitability in this. When human beings extend their reach, they extend it not only in the ways they intend, but in the ways that arise from the conditions they create. Medieval Europe was not unique in this respect, but the scale and pattern of its connections during the later Middle Ages created a particularly intricate web. Towns linked to towns, regions to regions, each connection strengthening the whole while also increasing its complexity. For the individual household, however, these larger patterns remained distant and abstract. What was felt directly was still the bed, the clothing, the room, the body. A person did not experience trade networks in the modern analytical sense. They experienced a blanket that felt less fresh than it should, a garment that carried an unfamiliar scent, a night of sleep that did not fully restore. The global and the local met in these small, immediate sensations. This is one of the reasons fleas provide such a useful lens. They allow us to see how large systems translate into intimate experience. A merchant's decision to purchase goods from a distant market, a ship's journey across a sea, a caravan's passage along a road. These events become meaningful not only in economic or political terms, but in the way they alter the conditions of daily life. The flea, moving quietly along these routes, connects the abstract to the tangible. It also reveals something about the limits of awareness. Medieval people could observe change in their surroundings, but they did not always connect those changes to distant causes. A household might notice that certain goods seemed to bring more trouble than others, or that certain seasons or routes were associated with discomfort, but the underlying mechanisms remained obscure. Knowledge was built from repeated experience, yet the scale of the system exceeded the ability of any individual to fully grasp it. At the same time, this did not prevent people from forming judgments and preferences. Merchants gained reputations. Inns were known for their quality or lack of it. Certain towns were considered cleaner, safer, or more pleasant than others. These reputations were not arbitrary. They reflected accumulated observations about the conditions of life in those places. Fleas, though rarely named explicitly in such reputations, contributed to them. A place that allowed for better rest, fewer irritations, and a greater sense of comfort would naturally be preferred. This preference, in turn, influenced behavior. Travelers might choose one route over another. Merchants might favor certain markets. Households might adopt practices they believed to improve their conditions. Over time, these choices shaped the flow of movement itself. The network was not fixed. It was responsive to human experience. And yet, despite this responsiveness, the underlying challenges persisted. Fleas remained part of the environment, adapting as people adapted, finding new spaces within changing conditions. There is also a quieter tension here between control and adaptation. Medieval people exercised a great deal of control within their immediate environment. They cleaned, organized, repaired, and maintained. But beyond the household, control became more diffuse. A town could regulate certain aspects of life, but not all. A region could influence trade, but not fully contain it. The further one moved from the individual household, the more complex and less controllable the system became. This tension is perhaps most visible in moments when the system was strained. A sudden increase in movement, whether due to trade opportunities, political events, or environmental pressures, could disrupt established patterns. More people passing through a town meant more demand on lodgings, more crowding, more rapid turnover of bedding and goods. Under such conditions, the careful balance of domestic life could be harder to maintain. Fleas, as ever, took advantage of the gap between ideal and reality. Yet even in these moments, life did not stop. Medieval society was resilient in part because it was accustomed to managing imperfection. People expected a certain level of discomfort. They did not assume that every problem could be solved completely. Instead, they worked within limits, adjusting practices, sharing knowledge, and relying on routines that had proven effective over time. It is within this framework of adaptation that we begin to see how the ordinary presence of fleas could intersect with more unusual developments in ways that were not immediately obvious. A traveler arriving from afar might bring with him not only goods and stories, but also subtle changes in the conditions of his clothing and bedding. A shipment stored in a warehouse might carry within it traces of environments far beyond the town in which it was opened. These traces were not recognized as such, but they influenced the local environment nonetheless. The result was a kind of layered reality, in which the familiar and the unfamiliar coexisted. A household might feel entirely typical, yet contain within it elements that originated elsewhere. A town might appear stable, yet be continually shaped by external influences. Fleas, moving through this layered reality, were both a constant and a sign of change. They were always present, yet their patterns of movement reflected the evolving connections of the medieval world. This dual role becomes more apparent when we consider how people responded to the accumulation of small discomforts over time. A single night of poor sleep could be dismissed. Repeated nights created a pattern. A household might begin to adjust its routines more deliberately, seeking ways to improve conditions. These adjustments, though local, contributed to a broader culture of domestic management. Practices spread through observation and imitation, creating a shared understanding of how to cope with persistent challenges. In this way, fleas indirectly influenced the development of habits and expectations. They encouraged attention to detail, to the condition of materials, to the arrangement of space. They reinforced the importance of maintenance as an ongoing process rather than a one-time task. They made visible the connection between environment and comfort, even if the underlying biology remained unknown. And as these habits became more refined, they also revealed their own limits. No amount of careful housekeeping could fully eliminate the problem. Relief could be achieved, but not permanence. This limitation was not unique to fleas. It applied to many aspects of medieval life. But fleas made it particularly tangible, because their effects were immediate and personal. It is at this point that the story begins to gather a different kind of momentum. The same networks that had gradually expanded, the same habits that had developed in response to everyday challenges, the same awareness of environment and comfort. All of these elements set the stage for moments when change would be felt more sharply. The ordinary would not disappear, but it would be reframed by events that made the hidden connections of the medieval world suddenly more visible, even if not fully understood. And what is most striking is how those moments often began in ways that felt indistinguishable from everything that had come before. A ship docks. A merchant opens a chest. A family welcomes a traveler into a spare corner of the room. A bundle of cloth is unfolded, inspected, and stored among other familiar possessions. There is no clear signal that anything has changed. The routines remain the same, the gestures practiced, the expectations steady. Yet within that sameness, something subtle has shifted. Not in a way that can be pointed to immediately, but in a way that accumulates. A room feels slightly less restful. A household notices that discomfort lingers longer than it once did. A neighbor falls ill in a manner that seems unfamiliar, though at first it is difficult to say why. These are not dramatic events. They are quiet deviations from expectation, easily dismissed on their own, but more difficult to ignore when they begin to repeat. This is how change often enters a pre-modern world, not as a single rupture, but as a pattern that gradually becomes harder to explain within existing habits. The same flea bite that once meant nothing more than irritation begins to sit alongside other signs that do not resolve as easily. The body, which had long endured minor discomforts as part of daily life, now becomes the place where uncertainty gathers. It is important to understand that medieval people were attentive to such patterns, even if their interpretations differed from modern ones. They noticed when a condition spread through a household or a street. They recognized when a familiar rhythm of recovery, rest, food, time, did not bring the expected relief. They observed when something that had always been manageable began to resist management. In those moments, the household once again became the center of response. Bedding was inspected more carefully. Clothing might be aired more frequently. Rooms were opened when weather allowed, in an attempt to refresh the air. Herbs were burned or hung, not as superstition in the dismissive sense, but as part of a long-standing effort to influence the quality of the environment. These actions were grounded in experience, in the belief that the condition of a space affected the condition of the body. But what becomes increasingly clear is that these familiar responses did not always produce the expected results. A household might do everything it knew to do, and yet the sense of unease remained. The connection between cause and effect, usually reliable in the management of everyday discomforts, seemed to loosen. This was not immediately recognized as a new kind of problem, but it created a space in which anxiety could grow. That anxiety did not appear as panic at first. It appeared as conversation. People spoke to one another about what they were noticing. They compared experiences. They asked whether others had felt the same discomfort, the same lingering fatigue, the same disturbances in sleep. In a world without centralized systems of information, knowledge moved through these small exchanges, forming a collective sense of whether something unusual was occurring. And still, the ordinary routines continued. Work did not stop. Markets remained active. Travel, though sometimes reduced, did not cease entirely. Life pressed forward, even as uncertainty began to weave itself into the fabric of daily experience. This coexistence of routine and unease is one of the defining features of the period we are entering. It reminds us that large-scale disruptions do not immediately replace ordinary life. They grow within it. Fleas, in this context, take on a different kind of presence. They are no longer simply irritants to be endured. They become part of a broader awareness of the body's vulnerability. A bite is still a bite, but it is now noticed differently. It belongs to a field of sensations that includes fatigue, discomfort, and the possibility, still indistinct, of something more serious. The same small creature, unchanged in itself, is reinterpreted through changing circumstances. There is a certain irony in this shift. Fleas had always been part of the environment. They had always shaped sleep, clothing, and domestic routines. Yet only when other pressures began to align did their presence acquire a new weight in human perception. This does not mean that medieval people suddenly understood a direct connection between fleas and larger events. Rather, it means that the boundaries between different kinds of discomfort became less clear. This blurring of boundaries had practical consequences. A household that once tolerated a certain level of irritation might now seek more aggressive solutions. Bedding might be replaced more urgently if resources allowed. Clothing might be cleaned or aired with greater frequency. People might avoid certain places or goods that they associated with discomfort, even if they could not fully explain why. These actions represent an intensification of existing habits, driven by a growing sense that the familiar was no longer entirely safe. At the same time, the limits of these responses became more visible. Resources were not unlimited. Time was still constrained by work. Weather still affected what could be done. A family could not simply discard all bedding or replace all clothing. A traveler could not always choose ideal lodging. The gap between what people wished to do and what they could do widened, and within that gap, uncertainty persisted. This is also where the communal nature of medieval life becomes particularly important. Individuals did not face these challenges in isolation. They were part of households, neighborhoods, parishes, and towns. Information, however incomplete, circulated through these networks. So did fear, though often in a restrained and practical form. People adjusted their behavior based on what they heard and observed, even if they did not articulate those adjustments in formal terms. In some cases, this meant avoiding certain areas or gatherings. In others, it meant paying closer attention to the condition of goods or the reputation of lodgings. These were not systematic measures in the modern sense, but they reflect an attempt to navigate an environment that felt increasingly uncertain. Fleas, as part of that environment, remained woven into these decisions, even if they were not the central focus. What is perhaps most revealing is how these developments did not immediately produce a clear narrative for those experiencing them. There was no single explanation that could account for the changes being felt. Instead, multiple interpretations coexisted. Environmental factors, divine will, personal health, and chance all played a role in how people understood what was happening. This plurality of explanation allowed life to continue, even as it made it more difficult to identify specific causes. And yet, beneath this complexity, the material reality remained constant. Bodies still needed rest. Houses still needed maintenance. Clothing still needed care. Fleas still moved through bedding and fabric, responding to warmth and proximity as they always had. The difference lay not in the nature of the flea, but in the context in which it was experienced. As the network of connections continued to tighten, as movement persisted, and as the accumulation of small changes began to alter the texture of daily life, the relationship between the ordinary and the extraordinary grew more intricate. The same actions, sleeping, traveling, trading, gathering, carried within them both familiarity and risk, and it was within this layered reality that medieval people found themselves adjusting, observing, and continuing forward, even as the world around them began to feel subtly, but unmistakably, different. What follows is not a sudden collapse of the familiar, but a slow reweighting of attention. The same household that once treated fleas as a predictable irritation now begins to treat the condition of the body with a slightly heightened caution. Sleep is not just rest, but something to be watched, whether it restores properly, whether discomfort lingers into the morning, whether a pattern of fatigue begins to form. The bed, once a place of imperfect comfort, becomes a place of quiet observation. And this shift does not happen in isolation. It happens across households, across streets, across towns, each one noticing small variations in the ordinary. A room that once felt merely stale now feels oppressive. A garment that once seemed acceptable now carries a faint unease. A night of scratching, once dismissed, now sits alongside other sensations that are harder to place. The difference is not dramatic, but it is persistent. In this environment, the management of domestic space becomes more deliberate, though not necessarily more effective. Bedding is aired with greater intention when weather allows. Clothing is handled with a kind of careful repetition, as though the act itself might restore a sense of control. Floors are swept, rushes replaced where possible, rooms open to whatever movement of air can be encouraged. These are not new practices, but they are performed with a slightly altered awareness. Yet even as this awareness grows, the limits of action remain. A household cannot transform its conditions overnight. Materials are still scarce. Labor is still demanded elsewhere. Weather still dictates what can and cannot be done. The effort to maintain comfort continues to exist within the same constraints as before, and those constraints ensure that the results are uneven. One room may feel better, another less so. One night may pass more easily, the next less predictably. This unevenness contributes to a sense of uncertainty that is difficult to resolve. If conditions improve in one instance, it is tempting to believe that the right method has been found. If they worsen in another, the cause is less clear. Medieval people, attentive as they were to patterns, now face patterns that do not behave as reliably as before. The connection between effort and outcome begins to feel less certain. And still, life moves forward. Markets open at their usual times. Goods are displayed, handled, and exchanged. The physical act of trade, touching cloth, weighing goods, inspecting materials, continues to bring people into contact with the very environments they are trying to manage within their homes. A merchant cannot refuse to handle his wares. A customer cannot purchase without contact. The routines of economic life remain intact, even as they carry within them the same subtle tensions. Travel, too, continues with a similar duality. A road that has always been used is still used. A lodging that has always been visited is still visited. But the experience of these places begins to shift in tone. A traveler may lie awake a little longer than before, noticing not just the familiar irritation of bites, but the quality of the air, the condition of the bedding, the proximity of others. The mind lingers where it might once have dismissed. This lingering attention extends to the body itself. Medieval people were accustomed to a certain level of physical hardship, but they were also skilled at reading their own condition. A laborer knew the difference between ordinary tiredness and something deeper. A parent could sense when a child's discomfort was more than fleeting. These sensitivities, developed through experience, now encounter a landscape in which signals are less clear. In this context, fleas become part of a broader language of the body. A bite is still recognized, still felt, still addressed in the same practical ways. But it no longer stands alone. It exists alongside other signs, contributing to an overall impression that something is slightly out of balance. The familiarity of the flea does not disappear, but it is reframed within a more complex set of observations. There is also a subtle shift in how people speak about their experiences. Conversations that once focused on immediate discomfort now begin to include comparisons. How one household feels compared to another, how one season differs from the last, how a particular place seems changed. These comparisons are not systematic, but they accumulate. They create a shared sense that the ordinary is not entirely stable. At the same time, explanations remain grounded in the frameworks available to the period. Air, environment, and general conditions are still seen as central to health. The idea that something in the surroundings could affect the body is not new, but it becomes more pressing. Efforts to improve the quality of the environment through cleaning, airing, scenting take on a renewed importance, even as their effectiveness remains uncertain. This renewed importance highlights a key tension. Medieval people are acting with intention, applying knowledge and habit, yet the results do not always align with expectations. This gap does not immediately lead to a new understanding, but it does create a space in which existing explanations are tested. Some actions seem to help in certain cases, others do not. The variability itself becomes part of the experience. And through all of this, the networks of movement continue to operate. Ships arrive, caravans pass, goods circulate, people travel. The system does not pause to allow for reflection. It continues to bring together distant regions, to mix environments, to redistribute materials and the conditions attached to them. Fleas, as ever, move quietly within the system, responding to its opportunities without regard for human concerns. What becomes increasingly apparent is that the scale of connection has reached a point where local experience is influenced by distant conditions in ways that are not immediately visible. A household may struggle with discomfort that has origins far beyond its own practices. A town may experience changes that reflect patterns of movement across regions. The immediacy of daily life is shaped by forces that extend beyond immediate perception. This realization does not arrive as a clear insight, but it begins to emerge in the form of unease. The sense that the environment is changing, that familiar routines are less reliable, that comfort is harder to secure, all contribute to a growing awareness that something is different. Yet the nature of that difference remains difficult to define. In such a moment, people continue to rely on what they know. They clean, they air, they manage their spaces as best they can. They observe, they compare, they speak to one another. They adjust their behavior in small ways, seeking to restore a sense of balance. Fleas remain part of this effort, both as a problem to be managed and as a reminder of the limits of control. And as these small adjustments accumulate, as households across regions engage in similar acts of maintenance and observation, the medieval world moves forward into a period where the ordinary pressures of daily life and the broader currents of change become increasingly intertwined, setting the stage for developments that will draw these hidden connections into sharper and far more consequential focus. What becomes noticeable first is not a dramatic event, but a change in how often certain conversations occur. Where once discomfort was discussed in passing, it now returns more frequently with a slightly altered tone. A neighbor mentions a household where rest has become difficult. A traveler speaks of lodgings that feel more unsettling than expected. A merchant remarks, almost casually, that certain goods seem to carry a different quality, though he cannot quite define what that means. These are not declarations of crisis. They are observations, offered quietly, but repeated often enough to gather weight. In this environment, attention shifts further toward the spaces where the body meets its surroundings. The bed, once again, becomes central not as a symbol but as a lived reality. People begin to notice not just whether they sleep, but how they wake. Is the body restored, or does it carry a lingering heaviness? Are small irritations fading as they once did, or remaining longer than expected? The difference is subtle, but it changes how individuals interpret their own condition. This attention also extends to others. Families watch one another more closely. A parent notices the sleep of a child, not simply for comfort, but for signs of something less easily explained. A household observes whether one person's discomfort becomes another's. Patterns of proximity, who sleeps where, who shares bedding, who moves between rooms, begin to take on a quiet significance. These patterns had always existed, but now they are felt more sharply. Fleas, still present as they always have been, remain woven into these observations. A bite is still recognized, still addressed, still part of the familiar routine. But it no longer stands alone as a simple explanation for discomfort. Instead, it becomes one element within a broader field of sensations. The body's experience grows more complex, and with that complexity comes a kind of hesitation. It is no longer enough to attribute every irritation to a known cause, yet there is no clear alternative. This hesitation shapes behavior in ways that are both cautious and limited. A household might attempt to separate sleeping spaces more deliberately if possible, though space often makes this difficult. Bedding might be rotated or aired with greater frequency, though weather and labor impose constraints. Clothing might be handled with increased care, though the number of garments remains fixed. These actions reflect a desire to regain clarity, to restore the connection between cause and effect. But the results remain uneven. One effort seems to help, another less so. A household might experience a period of relative comfort, only to find that it does not last. This inconsistency deepens the sense that something is shifting, even if its nature remains indistinct. The familiar rhythm of problem and solution begins to feel less reliable. At the same time, the wider networks of movement continue to exert their quiet influence. A town that has long functioned as a point of exchange now sees a slightly greater flow of goods. A port receives ships with increasing regularity. Roads carry travelers whose journeys connect regions that were once more distant in practical terms. These changes do not disrupt daily life directly, but they alter the conditions in which it takes place. Within these networks, the environments carried by goods and people become more varied. A bundle of cloth may have passed through multiple climates before arriving at its destination. A traveler may carry with him the conditions of several different lodgings. A shipment may have been stored in spaces that differ in cleanliness, humidity, and use. When these elements enter a household, they do so without announcement, blending into the existing environment. This blending creates a kind of layering that is difficult to disentangle. A room is no longer defined solely by its own history, but by the histories of the objects within it. A bed reflects not only the household that maintains it, but the materials from which it is made, the places those materials have been, and the bodies that have used them. Fleas, moving through this layered environment, are both part of the household and part of a wider system. It is in this layering that the limits of local control become most apparent. A household may maintain its space carefully, yet still experience conditions that originate elsewhere. Effort remains essential, but it is no longer sufficient to guarantee comfort. This does not lead to resignation, but it does alter expectations. People continue to act, but with a growing awareness that outcomes may not fully align with intentions. There is also a subtle shift in how space itself is perceived. Rooms that once felt stable begin to feel more dynamic, more influenced by what passes through them. A lodging that serves many travelers is understood, perhaps without being explicitly stated, to carry the traces of those travelers. A market stall that handles goods from various regions is recognized as a point of convergence. These perceptions are not articulated in systematic terms, but they influence behavior. In such a setting, reputation gains importance. Certain places become known for being more comfortable, more reliable, more conducive to rest. Others acquire a less favorable reputation, associated with discomfort or unease. These reputations are built from repeated experience, from the accumulation of small observations. Fleas, though rarely named directly, contribute to this process. A place where sleep is consistently disturbed will be remembered differently from one where rest is more easily found. This differentiation influences the flow of people and goods. Travelers may choose one route over another. Merchants may favor certain markets. Households may seek out materials they believe to be of better quality. These choices, in turn, reshape the network, creating patterns that reflect human responses to their environment. Yet, even as these patterns form, they do not eliminate the underlying challenges. They simply redistribute them. What becomes increasingly clear is that the medieval world is operating at a level of complexity that exceeds the explanatory tools available to those living within it. People are skilled observers, attentive to their surroundings, capable of adapting their behavior. But the scale of connection, the layering of environments, and the subtlety of change make it difficult to form a complete picture. Fleas, as part of this system, remain both familiar and enigmatic, known in their effects, but not fully understood in their broader role. And still, the body remains the point at which all of this is felt. A night of sleep that does not restore, a discomfort that lingers, a pattern that does not resolve. These are the experiences that bring the larger system into personal awareness. The connection between distant movement and immediate sensation is not recognized in analytical terms, but it is lived in the most direct way. As this continues, as households adjust, as networks remain active, and as the balance between familiarity and uncertainty shifts further, the stage is quietly set for a moment when the accumulated weight of these subtle changes will begin to press more heavily on the structure of daily life, revealing, with increasing clarity, just how deeply the smallest elements of the environment have always been tied to the largest patterns of the medieval world. And when that pressure begins to build, it does not announce itself in a way that separates the ordinary from the extraordinary. Instead, it makes the ordinary feel slightly unfamiliar. The same bed, the same room, the same routines. Yet something in the experience resists settling into its old rhythm. The difference is not dramatic enough to be named immediately, but it is persistent enough to be noticed. A household might begin to feel that its efforts are no longer producing the same results. Bedding is changed, aired, shaken out as it always has been, yet rest remains uneven. Clothing is handled with care, yet the body does not feel quite as comfortable within it. These are not failures in the obvious sense. They are small misalignments, subtle enough to be questioned, but frequent enough to be remembered. And memory in this context becomes important. Medieval people carried their understanding of the world not through written systems alone, but through lived comparison. They knew how a room had felt last season, how a bed had served them in the past, how a journey had once unfolded. When current experience began to diverge from those memories, even slightly, it created a quiet tension between expectation and reality. That tension is not resolved quickly. Instead, it encourages further attention. People look more closely at what surrounds them. A mattress is not just a place to sleep, but an object to be considered. Its age, its materials, its condition. A garment is not just worn, but noticed. Its weight, its scent, its feel against the skin. These observations had always existed, but now they carry a different emphasis. Fleas, still present, still active, continue to occupy their familiar place within this landscape. They remain small, visible, irritating, and manageable in the limited ways that have always been available. But they also serve as a constant reminder that the environment is never entirely under control. Each bite, each restless moment, reinforces the idea that something is always moving within the fabric of daily life, unseen until it makes itself felt. There is a quiet accumulation here, not just of discomfort but of awareness. A traveler might arrive in a town and notice that the lodging feels different from what he expected, though he cannot say precisely why. A household might receive goods that seem unchanged in appearance, yet bring with them a subtle alteration in the atmosphere of the room. A merchant might find that certain items require more care than before, though their origin and form remain familiar. These experiences do not yet form a clear pattern, but they begin to align in ways that make them harder to dismiss. The ordinary explanations, poor maintenance, unlucky circumstance, temporary imbalance, still apply, but they do not fully satisfy. There is a sense, not yet articulated, that the scale of what is happening extends beyond individual actions. At the same time, the structures of medieval life continue to function. Markets open, goods circulate, households maintain their routines. There is no pause, no moment in which society steps back to reconsider its foundations. Life proceeds as it must, even as the conditions within which it proceeds begin to shift. This continuity is essential to understanding the period. Change does not replace stability. It coexists with it. The same systems that sustain life also carry within them the seeds of disruption. Fleas, in their small and persistent way, illustrate this perfectly. They thrive in the very conditions that make human life possible: warmth, shelter, proximity, shared materials. As attention continues to sharpen, people begin to adjust not only their actions, but their expectations. Comfort is no longer assumed to return as reliably as before. A good night's sleep becomes something to be noted, rather than taken for granted. A room that feels fresh is appreciated in a way that reflects its increasing rarity. These shifts in perception are subtle, but they mark a deeper change in how the environment is experienced. There is also a growing awareness of difference between places. A town that once felt typical may now seem slightly more strained. Another may feel unexpectedly more tolerable. These impressions, built from individual experience, begin to influence movement. Travelers remember where they rested well, where they did not. Merchants note where goods seem to fare better. Households share these observations, shaping a collective sense of which environments are more manageable. Yet, even as these preferences form, they cannot fully escape the broader system. Movement continues, bringing new materials, new conditions, new layers of complexity into each space. A household may choose carefully, but it cannot isolate itself completely. The medieval world remains interconnected, and that interconnectedness ensures that local experience is always influenced by distant factors. Within this interplay, the body remains the most immediate measure of change. It is through the body that the environment is known, through sleep, through sensation, through the subtle signals of comfort and discomfort. Fleas, by acting directly on the body, maintain their role as a point of contact between the visible and the hidden. They are both a constant and a messenger, carrying with them the effects of conditions that extend beyond the immediate surroundings. And as these conditions continue to evolve, as awareness deepens and uncertainty lingers, the relationship between daily life and the larger patterns of the medieval world becomes increasingly difficult to separate. What happens in a distant port, on a long road, or within a crowded market does not remain distant. It arrives quietly in the form of altered experience, of a night's rest that feels different, of a household that feels less stable, of a body that does not respond as it once did. It is within this convergence of the intimate and the expansive that the story continues to unfold, carrying with it the sense that the smallest elements of daily life, so easily overlooked, so persistently present, are beginning to align with forces that will make their influence felt in ways that can no longer remain entirely hidden. And when that alignment begins to press more firmly against daily life, it does not do so by replacing what came before, but by intensifying it. The same irritations feel sharper. The same uncertainties linger longer. What was once background becomes foreground, not because it has changed in nature, but because its context has shifted. A night of broken sleep now carries more weight the following day. A household that feels slightly out of balance notices that imbalance more quickly. A traveler who once dismissed discomfort as part of the road now measures it more carefully, comparing one place to another with a heightened sensitivity. These are not dramatic transformations. They are refinements of attention, shaped by repeated experience. In this refined attention, fleas remain a constant reference point. Their presence is familiar, their effects immediate, their management part of established routine. But they now sit alongside other sensations that are less predictable. The body, once able to categorize its discomforts with relative ease, begins to encounter experiences that do not fit as neatly. The familiar irritation of bites does not fully explain the persistence of fatigue, or the way unease settles into the body even after rest. This does not lead to immediate conclusions. Instead, it produces a kind of watchfulness. People begin to notice not just what happens, but how often it happens, how it changes, how it compares. A household might recall that certain seasons once brought relief, yet find that the pattern has shifted. A merchant might notice that goods behave differently over time, even when handled in the same way. These observations accumulate slowly, forming a body of experience that is rich in detail but limited in explanation. And still, the structures of life continue to operate. The rhythm of the week, the cycle of work, the demands of survival, all remain unchanged. This continuity is what allows the changes to take root without immediate disruption. People do not stop living in order to understand what is happening. They continue adjusting where they can, observing where they cannot. There is a quiet resilience in this, but also a quiet vulnerability. The same adaptability that allows people to endure minor discomforts also allows them to absorb more significant changes without immediate recognition. A problem can grow within the fabric of daily life precisely because that fabric is strong enough to hold it, at least for a time. Within households, this creates a layered experience of normality. Some things feel as they always have. Others feel slightly altered. The distinction is not always clear, and it shifts from day to day. A room that seems tolerable one evening may feel oppressive the next. A bed that provides rest one night may fail to do so another. Fleas, ever present, continue to contribute to this variability, their bites marking the body in ways that are both familiar and, increasingly, insufficient as a full explanation. This insufficiency becomes more noticeable in moments of comparison. When multiple households share similar experiences, when conversations reveal patterns that extend beyond individual circumstance, the sense of a broader change begins to take shape. It is not yet defined, but it is felt as a shared condition rather than an isolated problem. At the same time, the movement of goods and people continues to weave these shared conditions together. A traveler carries his experience from one place to another, adding to the collective understanding. A merchant moves materials that bring with them traces of other environments. A town receives influences that originate far beyond its boundaries. These movements do not announce their significance, but they contribute to a gradual alignment of experience across regions. This alignment does not create clarity. Instead, it deepens the complexity. The more connections there are, the more difficult it becomes to isolate causes. A household may improve its practices and still encounter discomfort. A town may enforce order and still experience unease. The interplay between local effort and broader conditions becomes more apparent, even if it cannot be fully articulated. And yet, within this complexity, certain patterns begin to stand out. The body's response becomes a key indicator. When rest no longer restores, when discomfort persists beyond its expected duration, when familiar irritations fail to resolve as they once did, these signals draw attention. They are not understood in a modern diagnostic sense, but they are recognized as deviations from the expected rhythm of life. Fleas, in this context, continue to play their dual role. They are both part of the problem and part of the reference point. Their presence is known, their effects measurable in a simple way, but they also highlight the limits of that knowledge. When discomfort exceeds what fleas alone can explain, the gap becomes noticeable, even if it cannot yet be filled with a new understanding. This gap shapes behavior in subtle ways. People may become more cautious in their interactions, more attentive to the condition of their surroundings. They may choose where to rest with greater care, handle goods with a heightened awareness, maintain their spaces with renewed diligence. These actions are not driven by a single clear cause, but by an accumulation of experience that suggests the environment has become less predictable. At the same time, the demands of life ensure that caution has limits. Trade must continue, travel must occur, work must be done. The balance between caution and necessity becomes another layer of daily experience, one that is navigated without clear guidance. Fleas remain present in this balance, a constant reminder that the environment cannot be fully controlled, even when it is carefully managed. As this continues, as awareness sharpens and patterns align, the medieval world moves closer to a moment when the accumulated weight of these subtle changes will begin to manifest more clearly, not as a sudden break from the past, but as an intensification of conditions that have been building quietly within it. conditions in which the smallest elements of daily life, long tolerated and managed, will be drawn into a larger and more visible pattern of disruption that is already, in these quiet shifts, beginning to take form, and as that pattern begins to gather definition, it does so not by introducing something entirely new, but by altering the scale at which familiar experiences are felt. The same household routines continue, but their outcomes begin to diverge more noticeably from expectation. A night that should restore does not quite do so. A room that has been aired and tended still feels unsettled. The body, accustomed to a certain rhythm of discomfort and recovery, begins to register a subtle imbalance that does not easily correct itself. This is where the distinction between the manageable and the unmanageable begins to blur. Fleas, for all their persistence, belonged to the realm of the manageable. They could be seen, felt, and addressed even if imperfectly. Their presence had a certain predictability, but as the broader environment shifts, that predictability weakens. The familiar irritations remain, yet they no longer account for the full range of experience. In practical terms, this creates a sense of effort without clear resolution. Households work to maintain their spaces with the same diligence as before, sometimes with even greater care. Bedding is shaken out more frequently when possible. Garments are handled with attention, aired in whatever light and air can be found. Floors are swept, rushes replaced, rooms managed with the knowledge accumulated over generations. Yet the results feel less stable. This instability does not immediately suggest a cause, but it does encourage comparison. People begin to notice that what once worked consistently now works only sometimes. A method that improved comfort in one instance may fail in another. A place that once offered reliable rest may now feel uncertain. These inconsistencies accumulate, creating a pattern that is difficult to ignore, even if it cannot yet be fully explained. At the same time, the broader networks of connection continue to intensify. Movement does not slow. In many cases, it increases. More goods arrive, more people pass through, more interactions take place across regions. Each of these movements carries with it the same layered environments we have been tracing, materials, conditions, and the small organisms that accompany them. The result is a kind of quiet amplification. The same processes that once introduced minor variations now introduce more noticeable ones. A household may find that new goods alter the feel of a room in ways that persist. A traveler may encounter a series of lodgings that share a certain quality of discomfort. A town may experience changes that seem to extend beyond individual households. Fleas remain part of this amplification, their role unchanged in essence but altered in significance. They continue to move through bedding and cloth, responding to warmth and proximity as they always have. But they now operate within an environment that is itself shifting, making their effects more difficult to isolate. A bite is still a bite, but it is no longer a complete explanation for what is felt. This incomplete explanation is what gives rise to a deeper kind of awareness. Medieval people, attentive to their surroundings, begin to recognize that their usual categories are no longer sufficient. The environment still matters, but it behaves in ways that are less predictable. The body still responds, but its responses are more complex. The connection between the two, once relatively stable, begins to feel uncertain. In this uncertainty, behavior adapts in subtle ways. People may become more selective in their choices, even when options are limited. A traveler might choose to endure a longer journey to reach a lodging that feels more reliable. A household might favor certain materials over others, based on experience rather than clear reasoning. A merchant might adjust how goods are stored or handled, seeking to preserve their quality in ways that reflect changing conditions. These adaptations do not eliminate the problem, but they reflect an ongoing effort to restore balance. They also contribute to a shared sense that the environment is no longer entirely familiar. This sense is not expressed in dramatic terms. It is conveyed through small decisions, through preferences, through the accumulation of experience. There is also a growing recognition of how closely connected different aspects of life have become. What happens in one place seems to influence another in ways that are not immediately visible. A change in the quality of goods, a shift in the feel of a lodging, a pattern of discomfort shared across households. These experiences suggest that the boundaries between local and distant conditions are less firm than they once appeared. This recognition does not lead to a clear understanding, but it does alter perception. People begin to see their environment as part of something larger, even if they cannot define it. Fleas, in their quiet persistence, continue to illustrate this point. They move through the same connections that bind the medieval world together, linking the intimate space of the body with the expansive network of trade and travel. And as these connections continue to tighten, as awareness deepens, and as the gap between effort and outcome becomes more pronounced, the medieval world moves steadily toward a point where the cumulative effects of these changes will become more difficult to absorb within the existing framework of daily life, where the familiar presence of fleas and the subtle shifts in environment will be drawn into a larger pattern that is already, in these quiet and persistent ways, beginning to reveal itself. And it is at this stage that something almost paradoxical begins to happen. The more people try to restore the familiar balance of daily life, the more clearly they begin to notice that the balance itself has shifted. The effort remains the same, sometimes even greater, yet the results no longer align as they once did. A well-kept room still feels slightly unsettled. A carefully managed bed still produces uneven rest. The difference is not dramatic, but it is consistent enough to resist dismissal. This resistance changes the tone of daily experience. It introduces a kind of quiet doubt, not a fear that halts action, but a question that lingers beneath it. When a household does everything it knows to do and still feels a subtle discomfort, the cause becomes harder to place. The familiar explanations begin to stretch, accommodating more than they once did, yet never quite resolving the sense that something remains unaccounted for. In this atmosphere, attention continues to refine itself. People begin to notice sequences rather than isolated events. A restless night followed by another, a lingering fatigue shared across members of a household, a pattern of discomfort that appears in different places with a similar quality. These are not yet understood as connected, but they are experienced as more than coincidence. Fleas, once again, occupy a central but increasingly ambiguous position within this experience. Their presence is undeniable, their effects immediate, but their role becomes less definitive. They remain part of the explanation but no longer the whole of it. This shift does not diminish their importance. Rather, it places them within a broader context that is still taking shape. There is also a subtle change in how space is used. Rooms that once served multiple purposes without much concern may now be managed with slightly more intention. Sleeping areas are considered more carefully, even if they cannot be fully separated. Items are moved, adjusted, arranged in ways that reflect an attempt to influence the environment, however modestly. These changes are often small, constrained by the limits of space and resources, but they reflect a growing sensitivity to the relationship between surroundings and well-being. At the same time, the movement of goods and people continues to introduce new variables into these carefully managed spaces. A bundle of cloth that appears no different from any other may carry with it a subtle alteration in the feel of a room. A traveler, welcomed into a household, brings with him not only his presence but the accumulated conditions of his journey. These introductions are part of normal life, yet they contribute to the sense that the environment is no longer entirely stable. This instability is not experienced as chaos, but as a gradual erosion of predictability. What once followed a familiar pattern now behaves with slight variations. A household cannot rely as confidently on past experience to guide present action. Instead, it must adjust continually, responding to conditions that seem to shift without clear reason. In this context, communication takes on increased importance. People share their observations more readily, comparing notes on what they have experienced. These exchanges are not formalized, but they serve as a way of testing individual perception against collective experience. When similar patterns are reported across different households or locations, the sense of a broader change becomes more difficult to ignore. Yet even as this sense grows, it does not lead to a unified understanding. Medieval society does not possess the conceptual tools to map these patterns in a systematic way. Instead, multiple interpretations coexist, each offering a partial explanation. Environmental conditions, seasonal variations, personal health, and divine influence all play a role in how people make sense of what they are experiencing. This multiplicity of explanation allows life to continue without immediate disruption. People do not need to agree on a single cause in order to act. They continue to clean, to air, to manage their spaces, to adjust their routines. Fleas remain part of these actions, both as a target of effort and as a familiar presence within the environment. At the same time, the limits of these efforts become more apparent. A household may achieve a temporary improvement, only to find that it does not last. A traveler may find a place of rest that feels more comfortable, yet encounter the same discomfort elsewhere. A merchant may handle goods with care, yet notice that their condition changes in ways that are not fully controllable. This pattern of temporary relief followed by renewed uncertainty contributes to a growing awareness that the environment is influenced by factors beyond immediate control. The idea that local effort alone can maintain stability begins to feel less certain. Instead, there is a recognition, still indistinct, that broader conditions are at work. Fleas, moving quietly through this shifting landscape, continue to embody this tension. They are both a local problem and part of a larger system. Their presence is shaped by the immediate conditions of a household, but also by the wider networks through which materials and people move. In this way, they serve as a bridge between the intimate and the expansive, linking daily experience to broader patterns. As this awareness deepens, it begins to influence not only how people act, but how they perceive their place within the world. The household, once seen as a relatively contained environment, is now understood, if only implicitly, to be connected to forces beyond its boundaries. The room is not isolated. The bed is not self-contained. The materials that fill them carry histories that extend beyond the immediate present. This realization does not arrive as a clear statement, but as a gradual shift in perspective. It is felt rather than articulated, experienced through the accumulation of small inconsistencies and the persistence of subtle discomforts. Fleas remain part of this experience, their familiar presence anchoring the more elusive changes that surround them. And as these perceptions continue to evolve, as the balance between familiarity and uncertainty shifts further, the medieval world moves closer to a point where the patterns that have been quietly forming, through movement, through contact, through the layering of environments, will begin to assert themselves more clearly, drawing together the smallest details of daily life and the largest structures of connection into a moment that cannot remain entirely within the realm of the ordinary drawing. Together the smallest details of daily life and the largest structures of connection into a moment that cannot remain entirely within the realm of the ordinary. And when that moment begins to take clearer shape, it does so not through a single event that can be easily named, but through a deepening of all the signals that have been quietly building. The discomfort that once felt scattered begins to feel more consistent. The inconsistencies that could once be dismissed now seem to align. The environment, still familiar in appearance, begins to behave in ways that are harder to predict and harder to manage. In households, this is first felt as a change in rhythm. Days unfold as they always have: work, rest, meals, small routines, but the sense of recovery between them begins to shift. Fatigue lingers where it once faded. Sleep, already imperfect, becomes less reliable. The body carries forward the impressions of the previous day with greater weight. Fleas, still present in bedding and clothing, continue to interrupt rest, but now their familiar irritation blends into a broader sense that rest itself is becoming more fragile. This fragility alters how people approach the simplest parts of life. A bed is no longer just a place to lie down, but something to be prepared with a kind of quiet care. Bedding is adjusted, shaken, arranged with attention to detail, as though precision might restore what has been lost. The effort is real, and sometimes it brings relief. But the relief is often temporary, and its temporary nature becomes part of the experience. There is also a growing attentiveness to the movement of others. A visitor is welcomed, as hospitality requires, but there is an added awareness of what that presence might bring. A traveler's cloak, a bundle of goods, the simple act of sharing space. All are perceived with a sensitivity that was less pronounced before. This is not suspicion in a formal sense, but a recognition that proximity carries consequences that are not always visible. In towns, this sensitivity extends into public life. Markets continue to operate, but the handling of goods becomes more deliberate. Merchants may take greater care in how items are stored or displayed, not because they understand a specific risk, but because experience has taught them that conditions matter. Customers, in turn, may show a subtle preference for items that appear better kept, fresher, or less worn by time and use. These preferences are not universal, and they do not transform the structure of trade, but they contribute to a gradual shift in how quality is perceived. The condition of a material, its cleanliness, its freshness, its apparent history, gains importance beyond its immediate function. Fleas, again, are part of this perception. Their presence or absence influences how a space or object feels, even if it is not always explicitly acknowledged. As these shifts take place, the gap between expectation and reality continues to widen. A household may remember a time when certain practices were sufficient to maintain comfort. Now, those same practices seem less effective. The memory of past stability becomes a point of comparison, highlighting the difference rather than explaining it. This comparison creates a kind of temporal awareness. People begin to think not only about how things are, but how they have changed. A season that once brought relief may now feel less predictable. A routine that once worked reliably may now require adjustment. These reflections are grounded in lived experience, and they contribute to a sense that the present is not simply a continuation of the past. At the same time, the broader networks that connect regions continue to function with increasing intensity. More goods move through established routes. More people travel between towns and cities. The density of connection grows, even if it is not measured or described in formal terms. Each connection carries with it the same layered environments we have been tracing, adding complexity to every point of contact. In this context, fleas remain both constant and variable. They are always present, yet their patterns of presence shift with the changing environment. A place that once seemed manageable may now feel more difficult. A material that once caused little trouble may now carry a greater burden of discomfort. These variations reinforce the sense that the environment is in motion, even when it appears still. There is also a subtle change in how discomfort is interpreted. Where once it might have been seen as an isolated inconvenience, it now becomes part of a broader pattern. A bite is not just a bite, but one element within a sequence of sensations that do not resolve as expected. This does not lead to immediate conclusions, but it alters the way experience is understood. In response, people continue to adapt. They adjust their habits, refine their routines, share their observations. These adaptations are practical, grounded in what can be done within the limits of daily life. They do not eliminate uncertainty, but they represent an ongoing effort to navigate it. And yet, despite these efforts, the sense of imbalance persists. It is not overwhelming, not yet, but it is consistent. It shapes how people move through their days, how they prepare their spaces, how they interpret their own bodies. Fleas, as part of this experience, continue to mark the boundary between what is known and what is not fully understood. As this boundary becomes more apparent, the relationship between the intimate and the expansive grows more difficult to ignore. The household, the bed, the garment all remain central, but they are now understood, if only implicitly, as part of a larger system that extends beyond immediate control. The smallest details of daily life are linked to broader patterns of movement and change. And it is within this growing awareness, as attention sharpens and patterns align with increasing clarity, that the medieval world edges closer to a point where these connections, long present but rarely visible, will begin to assert themselves in ways that reshape not only how people understand their environment, but how they experience the very act of living within it. And it is within this growing awareness, as attention sharpens and patterns align with increasing clarity, that the medieval world edges closer to a point where these connections, long present but rarely visible, begin to assert themselves not just quietly, but unmistakably. When that shift finally settles into daily life, it does not erase what came before. Fleas do not disappear. Beds are still shaken, garments still aired, rooms still swept in the same careful, practiced ways. The routines of living remain almost unchanged in form. But what changes is how those routines are understood. The medieval household, once imagined as a place that could be managed through diligence and habit alone, is now recognized slowly, imperfectly, as something more porous. The walls do not fully protect. The bed does not fully restore. The body does not respond with the same reliability it once did. What had seemed contained is revealed to be connected, and what had seemed predictable becomes part of a larger, shifting pattern. Fleas, in this final sense, become more than just a detail of discomfort. They become a quiet symbol of that connection. They remind us that medieval life was never sealed off from the wider world, that every object carried a history, every journey left a trace, every act of sheltering also invited something in. They lived at the exact point where the human effort to create comfort met the natural world's refusal to be fully controlled. And perhaps that is the most revealing part of their story. Because when we look back at medieval Europe, it is easy to focus on the visible, on castles, on kings, on battles, on grand narratives that feel distant and defined. But most lives were not lived at that scale. They were lived in rooms that had to be managed day after day, in beds that did not always bring rest, in clothing that held both warmth and discomfort, in a world where the smallest details mattered because they were felt constantly. Fleas belonged to that world of constant sensation. They shaped how people slept, how they dressed, how they thought about cleanliness, and how they understood the limits of their own control. They forced attention onto the body, onto the environment, onto the relationship between the two. And through that, they quietly influenced the rhythm of life in ways that rarely entered written records, but never truly left lived experience. They also remind us that medieval people were not passive in the face of these challenges. They observed, adapted, experimented, and adjusted within the limits they faced. They created routines, passed down knowledge, and built habits that made life more manageable, even if never fully comfortable. Their world was not one of neglect, but of constant negotiation between effort and limitation. And in that negotiation, something deeply human becomes visible. The desire to rest, even when rest is uncertain. The effort to create order, even when disorder returns. The instinct to notice, to compare, to adjust, even without full understanding. These are not distant, unfamiliar behaviors. They are recognizably our own, shaped by different conditions, but driven by the same need to make life livable. So when we think about what fleas did to daily life in medieval Europe, the answer is not simply that they caused discomfort. It is that they exposed the fragile balance of that life. They revealed how much work went into maintaining even a modest sense of comfort, and how easily that balance could be unsettled by forces both seen and unseen. And perhaps more quietly, they remind us that history is not only made in moments of great change, but in the accumulation of small, persistent experiences, the kind that shape how people sleep, how they feel, and how they move through the world each day. If there is one detail from this world that lingers, it is not just the image of a restless night, but the understanding that such nights were not exceptions. They were part of the fabric of life, woven into the routines and realities that defined an entire era. And in that fabric, in those dim rooms and shared beds and carefully tended spaces, the story of medieval Europe continues, not only in what people built or ruled, but in how they endured, adapted, and carried on within a world that was never quite as comfortable or as controlled as it might first appear. If you've stayed with this journey, I'd be genuinely curious, what part of this daily reality felt the most difficult to imagine living with? And if you enjoy these quieter, deeper looks into the past, there's always more history waiting to be explored, one detail at a time.